This is the Power of Genetics podcast, the podcast designed to help visionary practitioners build a more successful practice, transform more lives, and lead their patients into the future of personalized health. In each episode, I'll interview successful practitioners and leading thought leaders who will share their insights and expertise to help you prepare your practice for what lies ahead. I'm your host, Dr. Yael Jaffe, and now, let's get into today's episode. A very good morning to a friend and colleague, Tom Blue. I have been waiting 3 seasons to have Tom join me on the Pave Genetics podcast. So welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to get to see and talk to you.
So today's a little bit different. Usually I have a Dr. So-and-so or a Dr. So-and-so, but actually what is so fantastic about having Tom join us is Tom is one of those behind the scenes individuals who is having a huge impact on the way we practice medicine, the way we practice nutrition. And as you well know, my favorite topic on this podcast is how certain individuals go out there and change paradigms or ways of doing things. So Tom, perhaps you could start off. I always kind of start off like, I hate the idea of reading out a bio. So I always ask my guests to tell us a little bit about themselves, where you came from, what you studied, where you live, and why you kind of started out in what you did and how that kind of evolved.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I guess if I were to encapsulate what has been a big focus of mine, it has been, innovating around delivery models for sort of next generation healthcare, and with a particular focus on primary care and sort of preventive health. I stumbled into it, frankly, as people do more than 20 years ago, like 21, 22 years ago now. I'd been doing some interesting work in, by a weird turn of events with commercializing a set of patents from NASA Langley I live in Virginia and just so down the road, they were commercializing some patents that had to do with attention training using EEG biofeedback. And we developed a consumer electronics, essentially, packaging of a EEG biofeedback device that went into clinical trials. And one day I found myself, when it's things in clinical trials, you can't sell it. And the investors had decided that they were going to chop the patents up and sell this off. So we weren't going to continue the company. And one of the board members, approached me and said, look, I think I would love to enlist your help in starting up a medical practice. And she had read an article on an airplane about a concierge medical practice that had sparked up out near where you are in Seattle, and was imagining that it would be wonderful to have such a thing in Richmond, Virginia, where we live. And it was an interesting idea in so much as neither of us were doctors. And so starting a medical practice when neither of us were doctors or had ever worked in a medical practice before, but as circumstances were, I kind of didn't have anything else to do. And it sounded like an exciting adventure to embark on. And so off we went and formed the first concierge medical practice in Virginia. And it was probably only, I don't know, maybe the 12th or 13th. There were very few of them at the time.
Yeah.
In fact, it was just, it was barely understood that doing it was even legal. So to give you an idea of how much has changed in 20 years, in 2001, when we were doing this, there was actually a very real question as to whether a doctor could legally sell to a patient a service which was not covered by insurance. And yes, yes.
Sir?
And at the time, it was only a memo by Tommy Thompson, the then acting Health and Human Services, that in fact memorialized that it was in fact a permissible thing for a doctor to sell to a patient something not covered by insurance. So if you think about that sort of bit of history in U.S. healthcare and the influence of the payer system over what was at the time accessible to patients, it's just a really interesting thing to note. So anyway, so we set this practice up. Now, most as practitioners listening to this will know, if you've ever done this, most membership-based practices are born out of what people call a practice conversion. And so the story would be a doctor who has been in his or her community for a long time, loved by patients, fed up by the payer system and having to work so fast and not have deep relationships with people, might say, you know what, I'm going to switch to a membership model and accept the fact that, 80% of my patients probably won't want it, but I'll stick with the 20% who do, and they'll all pay, $1,800 a year or whatever, possibly in addition to insurance or not. and I'll carry on that way. And that's how most of these practices are born. And so, but in our case, because none of us are doctors, we had to go find a doctor that wanted to do this thing that might not even be legal and no one had ever heard of before. And this is back in a time when it's like a copay is $10.
That's so early. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
so
the
early.
primary care kind of crisis hadn't hit. Literally, a copay was $10 or $20. You could easily get an appointment and find a doctor that had space for you. So it was a daunting task to try and create a value proposition that would compel a person to want to reach into their pocket and, again, do something that was almost unheard of, which would be literally unheard of, to invest your own money above and beyond a copay in an encounter of any kind with a physician. So anyway, we finally found a guy. I mean, it was hard to find someone to do this. We found someone to do it. He lived way out of town, and 7 patients followed him into the practice. So now we have built out a space, all this, and there's 7 patients. So now, as we're doing this, I had the need to, of course, identify where we wanted to set up. Now, this story, by the way, is going to get to a point that we can sort of probably build the whole conversation around. So be patient. It's an interesting tip. So, all right, it's like, set up a medical practice, got to have a place to have it. So I'm driving around looking at medical spaces, and there's this one that was in sort of a medical park. And as I was looking at it, I'm like, the interesting thing about this space was it was right next door, like it shared a wall with Richmond's first electron beam tomography scanner. So this CT scanner that basically did 3 things. And I loved it because I didn't understand any of the 3 things really, but it looked like the Starship Enterprise. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, if we set up right next to this, and heaven forbid there's some role that this machine can play in our service, it would just, like, whatever that thing is will rub off, the coolness of it will rub off on us. That was literally my thinking on this. And so what this machine did, it did 3 things. It did a whole body scan, which to me sounded awesome. It did a virtual colonoscopy, which to me sounded awesome. I'm like, who wouldn't rather have a fake, virtual colonoscopy than a real one? And then it did something I had no earthly idea what it even meant. So it sounded not awesome, which was coronary calcium scan. And so it turned out, so we immediately did weave this thing into our annual health assessment. And the coolness of this machine was in the exact opposite order. The whole body scan was a disaster because of all the incidentalomas with CT scanning. It scared the crap out of everyone. So we immediately stopped using it. The virtual colonoscopy was a total disaster because you have to be inflated with air in order to do it. And so it's like we're inflating people full of air, only to then tell them they have to have a real colonoscopy if they see anything in there. So that was a joke. And it turned out the real value of this was in the coronary calcium scoring and the early identification of cardiovascular disease. And so at that very same time, so we're now using this down in North Carolina. A lab called Liposcience had just come into being. And they were the very first folks really pioneering the advanced lipid testing. So, fractionating lipids out so you could see particle size and all this other stuff, get much better insight into the value or the risk of your lipid profile. And meanwhile, we have a doctor with 7 patients. And so the doctor's got plenty of time on his hands to learn about the calcium scoring next door, the Liposcience down in North Carolina. And a few months later, we had what probably was as good or at the very tippity top of cardiovascular risk assessment and management capabilities in this brand new medical practice. And so what dawned on me at that very time, and that practice grew and grew. It was then acquired by an equity fund. It's now it has multiple. It's a very, very large concierge medical practice. So it's continued to do well. What I learned though in that very first year was, and has proven to be a driving force in the rest of my professional life, is that there are really 2 worlds of medicine. There's the world that everyone knows, and then there's this future world that's actually here today, that is where it's like you can step into it and access a version of medicine that's 10 or 15 years beyond what we think of today. And I saw this with this coronary calcium scoring and the advanced lipid testing and the early detection of heart disease we would do, for all these patients, and how dramatic the effect of redirecting the trajectory of their health was as a result of this. And so, it was quite remarkable to me. I'm like, I started to reflect. I'm like, this is kind of wild that there's a future of healthcare that exists today, and yet almost no one has access to it. And so then I started thinking, well, so what is it that enables a person to have access to the future of medicine today? And the answer to that is that you have to have two things, basically. You have to have a doctor or a practitioner that is willing and able to learn about this new thing. And which is not as simple as it sounds, because most practitioners live on a treadmill of productivity and are, as more and more of them are part of large groups and health systems, they're constrained as to what they can actually do. And in some cases, even what they can learn. So you need that one remarkable thing. The second thing that you need that's remarkable is you need a patient population that is willing to make an investment in their health that is not covered by insurance. And so recognizing that the payer system, despite at that time, the fact that it literally was dictating what we had access to, the payer system, it shouldn't be the curator of the healthcare services that you make available to yourself to manage the future of your own health. And that, in fact, you and your doctor should be the curator of those services, and the money, whether it is or isn't covered by insurance, is a secondary factor. And when you think about it, while we're on that topic, we have a confusion in the United States. I don't know. I'd be curious to know if this confusion exists in South Africa. But in the US, we have a very confused relationship with health insurance, even to this day. And so, people listening to this conversation right now, I would imagine all of them have probably three types of insurance. They have their auto insurance, they have their homeowner's insurance, and they have their health insurance, and maybe life, whatever. But if you think of those three types that almost everybody has, in two of the three cases, we have a really clear understanding of the relationship that we've entered into. We have entered into a financial arrangement that allows us to be protected from financial ruin in the unlikely event of a horrible car crash, your house burns down, things like this. In the case of health insurance, however, we have this delusion that insurance should pay for not only the catastrophe, but the preventive maintenance of our health. And so it's like, when you think of this in the context of the other two, it's like you wouldn't expect Geico to rotate your tires, change your windshield wiper blades, put oil in the car. You know what I mean? It's like, that's absurd. Of course, Geico wouldn't pay for that. But in the case of health insurance, we have abdicated responsibility for the care and maintenance of our bodies, which is not, by the way, a risk. There's no risk associated with prevention. 100% of us need it. And there is also no financial ruin associated with accessing it. So it's an inappropriate use of insurance. And yet it's become deeply, deeply etched into our psyche as the American healthcare consumer. And so when you can help someone break with that relationship with insurance, which oftentimes is as simple as this 3 minutes we've devoted to this right now, it's like people wake up, they're like, this is absurd. That's not the role of insurance, to be the arbiter of what I do from a preventive maintenance standpoint. That's a matter of personal values. And I pay for it on my own. Suddenly, a whole new world of healthcare opens up in front of us. And it turns out, as fascinating as I found this, it's a thing that it's been studied, this time lag between when something is proven to work well, safely, it should be in widespread use, and the time in which that thing becomes widely used in medicine, holding aside a pharmaceutical.
Right. Yeah.
It's like 17 years. And the name that is given to this time delay is called the translational gap. And so I am very much about at least my career has been very much about compressing the translational gap and finding ways to do that at greater and greater scale. How's that for a 15-minute answer to a simple question?
15 minutes, 3 minutes. Well, I thought it was an amazing 15 minutes and a lot of food for thought. And so while I was listening to you, so I think the thing is that I need to kind of contemplate and really resonates is the idea of our expectation around health insurance and why perhaps we're always disappointed because our expectations are actually wrong. And it's easier to abdicate our responsibility of prevention to a company rather than do the work ourselves. So fascinating. So I've never thought of it that way. I'm going to contemplate it more. So just to give some context, I have had countless interactions with you in the last, 10, 15 years. And so I just want to touch on some of the more interesting ones to just show how Tom kind of functions in this world of healthcare. But the first one I think was, well, I've heard you speak a few times, but the first interesting one is when I took a course that James Maskell offered around converting so I had a clinic, a nutrigenomics clinic, and I wanted to converted to, I don't know what you call it. It wasn't concierge, but it was like, what do you call it? Subscription based.
Yeah, membership. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's concierge, yeah, membership based kind of concierge practice. And I wanted to do this course that James Maskell was offering, but it actually ended up being Tom talking for like 3 days. There was no James, it was just Tom. I just listened to Tom teaching us how to convert the practice. So that was my first engagement, which was amazing. And then when I founded 3x4, of course, 3x4 Genetics, the great story is Tom and I were at a conference in, I think it was Seattle, and we were both wandering around the exhibition hall instead of being in a presentation, which is what Tom and I often do. And I think I was making tea, as I often do, and bumped into Tom and said, "Hi, how are you? Do you remember me?" Anyway, and he's like, "What are you up to?" As Tom often does. And I was like, "I started this genetics company in South Africa," and we got chatting, and I showed him the report, and he was like, "You're in South Africa? Like, what are you doing in South Africa? Why aren't you in America?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not sure. It's too soon. We're still testing the product." And I remember you were like, "This is insane. You need to come to America right now." And that conversation with Tom actually changed the trajectory of 3x4 completely, because after that conversation, I went back to South Africa and said, "We're pivoting the company. We're going to America." And here we are 2 years in. And really it began with Tom kind of looking at what we were doing and going, "There's nothing like this in the States." So thank you very much for that very pivotal moment. And in fact, because of it, Tom actually joined us right in the beginning when we were trying to figure out as an advisor of how to come into the US and what it would look like. And we had some very funny moments with Tom trying to help us set up. So the reason I wanted Tom on this is because he's my go-to guy of what is happening. You know, I always say, like, Tom's got more fingers and more pies in this healthcare space than anyone I know. And if there is an interesting company out in the marketplace, Tom's usually talking to them or knows about them or is involved with them or is helping them. So I guess what would be interesting to know is, because you are so kind of connected with what is happening, is based on your initial story, which I loved, and where we are now 20 years later, in effect, what is your perception of what is happening at the moment? Like, what are you seeing out there and hearing that is exciting you and that is like inspiring you for what the next decade's going to bring?
Well, it's interesting. At this moment, if you fast forward from 20 years ago, what are the things that have happened? Well, the health values of the consumer population have evolved dramatically. And it's not just that we're becoming more enlightened. I honestly think in the United States, I think that evolution has had a lot to do with essentially the increasing assignment of healthcare costs to the consumer in the form of high deductible policies. And so it's like gradually folks are waking up to the fact that being unhealthy costs money, and I'm kind of paying my own bills anyway, you know, in the form of a deductible that most people never meet anyhow. So it's like, so there's a far greater willingness of people to go out on their own and invest in their own health than there was 20 years ago. So that's a big cultural awakening. And, you know, simultaneous to that, you know, we've had, and again, I'm unpacking this in a U.S. kind of way. You know, hopefully the audience is
that's good
value out of that. Another big thing that happened was with Obamacare, the uncapping of lifetime limits on insurance. And so the importance of that is that, I mean, I can remember back in the 1990s, my mom had been very ill. We were very conscious as a household about her hitting a lifetime limit. I want to say it was like of $1 million cumulatively, after which the insurance company was off the hook for medical bills. And so it was like, you know, it was a big thing. Well, that is no longer the case. You can run up a $30 million medical bill in 1 year now. And so what's happened, of course, is that we now have these specialty medications that cost $6,000 a month. It's uncapped thing. So it's messed with our health economy, but it's also created a huge value around the ability to alter the trajectory of a person's health and reverse a chronic condition, if you can activate the patient in that process. So the market for this type of thing, the future of health that we're talking about, is now no longer just the health enthusiast consumer, but the self-insured employer and possibly the health plan. And maybe one day, you know, the government itself. And so the appetite for the sorts of things that get us excited is far, far larger than it was. This is not just luxury medicine for wealthy people anymore. It's critically important, the whole concept of reversing chronic disease. So that's happened. Then you throw in well, I'll break my chronological order. I guess then you throw in to bring this into your world, the sequencing of the human genome and what that's done, sort of the evolution of the story of health that's occurred in our lifetime. So if you think about this, and this has just been a real fascination of mine as well, thinking about health consumers and us as stewards of our own health. If you think about it, from the dawn of time, literally, that people started thinking about their health, until only very recently, the basic story in terms of the locus of control for health was always the same. In the 2,000 years ago, maybe your health was a matter of the will of the gods, your past sins, bad luck, whatever. It certainly wasn't within your control. Fast forward all the way to 2001. We're told by the news, by Bill Clinton and Craig Venter and the news, that we've cracked the code of life, and now we have the book of health, in the form of our genetics. And if you think about it, it's a much more high-tech story, but the locus of control was still one of predestination in the form of whatever's in your genetics. And so only since then have we started to realize that, in fact, 70-80% of what we experience as health or disease arises from the interaction of what we do with our genetics to dictate how those genetics are expressed and what we experience as health. Which is to say that in the last 12, 13, 14 years, the locus of control for health is 180 degrees shifted from predestination to self-determinism. And so what we can then conclude is, if 80 or so percent of our health arises from what we do, then health is, more than anything, you'd have to conclude, a skill that we have to develop and cultivate. And the problem with that is we can't easily build a school to teach the skill of health, because, as you well know better than anyone, the behaviors that lead to optimal health for me, because of my unique genetics, are different than they are for you. And so there's this need to personalize. And so it's like we're in this moment where people are just awakening to the agency they have over the future of their health. Then they're beginning to realize, those, a smaller group, it's like, well, geez, I can't just do this on there's no one size fits all. That's all the diet books that sit on everyone's shelf. It's like, there's been a great example of how you just can't find the one thing that works for everybody. And so there's this need for personalization and to make personalization accessible and affordable. And as a practical matter, the way I view personalization is, from a health promoting standpoint, is it increases the return on effort that people put into their health. Like you and I were talking about the other day with the elimination diet, the ability possibly to use genetics to spare the effort of having to go through the gauntlet of an elimination diet, to me, is a very important thing. If we think about it, let's come back to a discussion of the value formula for health, and we can dive more deeply into that. So then the last thing that I would say, has kind of happened, that's shaping what's exciting and happening today, is COVID, which has done two things. Number one, it has radically accelerated the acceptance of healthcare delivered virtually. Radically, 10 years. And the second thing that it's done is it has, for many people, I think, exposed the difference between managing a chronic disease and reversing a chronic disease. Meaning that the quote, well-managed diabetic was exposed by COVID. It's like you may be taking your meds and your insulin and whatever, but COVID looked right past that and exploited that vulnerability. Whereas the person who did the work to reverse diabetes had a totally different risk profile. And so I think a lot of people woke up to this ridiculousness of a well-managed, chronic disease. It's funny. Yeah. I can remember doing talk, 10 years ago or something on this ridiculous oxymoron that we've been sold as a society, that we can be sick and healthy at the same time. And I Googled sick healthy and went to the images, and there's all these books and apps, how to be sick, how to be well while being sick. And, it's a terrifically profitable campaign for the system to convince us that sickness and health are not mutually exclusive things, and we can be both at the same time. And it's a wonderful, wonderful campaign. But if you're making money on
pharmaceuticals,
yeah, exactly. So anyway, so I think that then sets the stage for where we are today. So let's think about, and then I'll go throw in one other thing. following people are familiar with Moore's law and the radically advancing efficiencies of technologies. It's simultaneous to their declining costs. And what we've seen in the world of precision health is that Moore's law is being dramatically outpaced by, like, look at the costs of sequencing a human genome, going from whatever it was, $1 million, back in 2000 or $100 million, to where it is today at, certainly sub 1,000. I don't even know what it's hundreds of dollars. And so you see the same thing in the sensor technologies that we now have access to, where, we both, I think, are wearing Oura rings and you can put your continuous glucose monitor on for $50 or whatever. It's like we now have access, we're able to harness. I'll quote a guy that I once spent the day with, a guy named Patrick Soon-Shung, who said, he was a physician and physician entrepreneur. He said, we are all a human data signal engine, was what he said. And what you said, we're broadcasting data out of our bodies all the time. And today we actually have the capacity to capture a lot of that passively and make sense of it and blend it, with the data we can gather from sequencing our genome and what have you, and derive huge insights from it. And those sensors are now affordable, as are the testing that allows us to really engage in real personalization and maximize our return on effort. And so I think that, you kind of combine these things, that we're going to see, more and more at scale, personalized health interventions that are focused on disease reversal, certainly health promotion as well. But the big market for it in terms of return on investment is in the reversal of chronic conditions and changing the cost trajectory, delivered virtually by multidisciplinary care teams. So not everything falls to the shoulders of the doctor. You've got health coaches and nutrition professionals and others that actually, when you build out these episodes of care, you realize very quickly that it's those allied practitioners that actually carry the bulk of the
holding the space.
Relationship.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So I think we're going to see an explosion in that, particularly in the health coaching profession, as these things take place. And I think we're going to see that the way healthcare is packaged is going to evolve. And this is a little bit humbling for me to say, because, as you know, I spent many, many, many years really evangelizing a subscription-based model for care delivery, which I still actually believe in for primary care and things that are a relationship that's evergreen. But the truth of the matter is that the way people that have a health problem want to buy health solutions is they want to buy the outcome. They don't want a subscription that implies the outcome. Yeah. It's like, I want a fixed package that's designed to solve my problem. And I think we're going to see more and more. I am almost literally all of my work these days is built around building, in technical parlance, bundled episodes of care that target particular problems. And so there's all kinds of benefits to that method of packaging, in terms of inherently that structure drives innovation and efficiency that creates value instead of creating more cost, which is sort of the way a fee for service model naturally breeds more cost, because everyone participating wants to maximize their revenue. Does that answer your question?
That totally does. I've got a whole lot more than I was hoping for, expecting. And I totally agree. And if I look at the last couple of episodes of the podcast that I recorded, it's all about disease reversal. So it's Dale Bredesen, it's Dr. Perlmutter, so we're talking about migraine, we're talking about Alzheimer's, we're talking about cardiovascular, we're talking about diabetes. And, I remember when I spoke to Dr. Bredesen, it was about this idea of these chronic diseases being optional and not inevitable. And I think that is such a fundamental shift. And I completely agree about the episodes of care rather than the kind of long, really kind of unimaginable outcomes. So I think we're seeing the same thing. And I think there's incredible value. I think I might have to come back for another season, because I really want to talk about kind of that value formula for care. And I think there's so much our practitioners can learn from what you're saying about how they think about their practices, how they think about their patients, how they think about their future and what they should be looking for, bringing a little bit of your philosophy into their practice of what's coming in the future that's actually here. And I think that story about the coronary calcium is amazing, because I actually didn't realize it was out in the market so early.
Yeah.
People say, I tell people I built the first Nutrigenome test in 2000. They're like, 2000? That was like 3 years before, So I think that's all extremely valuable. And I know your time is also valuable. So I'm going to finish with one last question, and I am going to have you back in the next step, because I have so many other questions I want to talk through. But let's just round it out. As this is the Power of Genetics podcast. So we need to just give it a little, and you have touched on it. But having watched the evolution of genetics, and I think you said it so beautifully when you spoke about this locus of control around kind of this destiny of genetics when the world was defined genetics by SNPs. And now we know that we can change gene expression, the world of epigenetics, that we can use genetics to understand who we are, but we can make decisions and choices to change gene expression. And I love what you said, because that actually defined perfectly my career, going from the first 10 years, even the first 15 years, where my whole world was gene variants and SNPs, and this is what we've got. And now the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years has all been about how do we enlighten people to make decisions that can change gene expression. So I think that defined my career beautifully. But to go back to my question, which is, how do you see genetics playing a role in healthcare now and into the next future? What is your idea on how we're going to see genetics play out? A little bit, you did cover it a little bit, but maybe just a bit more.
Yeah. Well, I will say genetics in many ways it's sort of the most exciting and the most disappointing thing that's happened.
Love it.
In the last 20 years.
Totally agree.
And so let's talk about genetics more from a health promoting standpoint or a disease reversal standpoint, and not, the many other applications of genetics. But from that perspective, and I'm sure I'm not unique at all in this regard, have always found is like the patient experience with genetics is always such a letdown, because it's
underwhelming.
Yeah. And it's and from the practitioner perspective, it's so difficult because you've got so much data and you've got to somehow synthesize it into a 20-minute or 30-minute or a reasonable consultation and hold the attention of a person and reduce it to just a few things to take action on. And so it's a massive ask of the practitioner who doesn't have a lifetime to spend on this, which is why I your report, when you first showed it to me, was so striking. There's been so little creativity brought to how to solve this problem. It's like there's this massive wealth of insight in this giant vat of data. And it's like you're asking a practitioner who hasn't devoted a career like you have to somehow fashion a consult that means something to someone and that prompts action. And so the potential is that you have the skeleton key to finding the highest return things to invest your effort and time and money in, and now it's affordable, so it's like you've got this potential skeleton key, but it has to be made digestible to the consumer and applicable to the practitioner. And so I actually think that, and I continue to think that where you've really led the field is in the most important way, which is the creative presentation of this information in a way that a consumer can receive it, a practitioner can convey it, and they don't have to become a genius like you are. They've got the consult in their hand, and they can much more easily learn to have a high impact consult from that presentation of genetics than any other presentation of genetics that I've ever seen, which tends to be sold by the pound. It's like, here's your 80-page report. It means nothing.
10,000 genes. That means
exactly.
Nothing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's what we're going to see. And so there's a couple of bits of real value that I'm hoping that people will start to get from their genetics. One is the insight leading to a greater willingness to invest effort. And so moving people in one giant fell swoop across the readiness to change continuum from like, I felt disempowered to holy crap, I'm understanding some things about myself. And I know that if I invest effort only here and here, I'll move the needle. And so creating that positive momentum, I think, is going to be huge. And the truth of the matter is, the first evolution of that is creating an army of practitioners of various types capable of delivering a high impact consultation. Of course, is born out of a well-built report and presentation from an innovator like you.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously I love our report, but I think the one thing I understood is that you can't. I totally agree about genetics. Underwhelming. It's been the greatest success and the greatest failure of the last 2 decades, and that we figured out how to test it, but we didn't figure out how to translate it and make it valuable and impactful. And I have my favorite slide in any deck I have is insight and action. Genetics gives us insight, but we need to drive action. And action is where we use nutrition and choices to switch on, switch off genes and really impact health. And I think, as I said, my first part of my career was all about insight. And now I've finally been able to bring the two together. And I think when I launched 3x4, I realized, first of all, the failures of the industry that I'd been a part of for a decade and a half, I would say. And then suddenly had the epiphany that we were just not changing lives, not changing behavior, that we had outsourced that idea that genetics should change, drive behavioral change, and just said, here's some data, figure it out.
Right.
And the whole premise of 3x4 was not to just offer a better report and a better science, which I believe we have, but to really uplift the whole industry. And that means, as you say, like teaching, educating, mentorship, community, bring back practitioners together, help them be educated in a way that actually is meaningful, provide a value proposition. And most important, like the action piece, like, how does this drive behavioral change? And so I loved your whole kind of from inside, DNA sequence through to actually I wake up in the morning and I'm having a different breakfast than I had yesterday. So I think it's going to be interesting another 10 years when I look back at these couple of decades and see, sometimes you never step away because you're so close. And I think our conversation today has been really amazing for me because I actually look back and think of how things have evolved so much, locus of control, that insight to action, and where our real power lies is in that translational value to the patient. And that comes back to your initial conversation, which is about all of us taking responsibility for our health. So I love this conversation, Tom Blue. I always love our conversations, but this has been particularly thought-provoking for me. So thank you very much for joining me. And we're going to have to continue in another season, because I think there's just so much value to practitioners to be thinking about these things, which they don't hear. They're not on a daily basis having these conversations. None of us are.
Right.
So thank you very, very much. And I look forward to the next time.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and great to see you.
Thank you for listening to the Power of Genetics podcast, brought to you by 3x4 Genetics. For more episodes, please visit 3x4genetics.com/podcast. And if you are a licensed health practitioner who would like to apply to join our network of over 1,000 like-minded visionary practitioners, please visit 3x4genetics.com/apply.